Let's dive right into a really gripping explainer today. We're looking at a powerful original story called The Pastor Who Couldn't Be Forgiven. It's this devastating modern moral dilemma, deeply inspired by J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace, and it tackles some incredibly heavy themes like accountability, spiritual authority, and the real cost of grace. It asks the kind of questions that just don't have easy answers, and let me tell you, the tension is dialed up right from the very first scene. So picture this phrase: grace is greater than your worst day. For 30 years, this exact phrase was Pastor Nathaniel Mercer's signature message. He preached it to the broken in hospitals, at funerals, to people whose lives were just completely falling apart. But in a brutal stroke of dramatic irony, this exact sentence is glowing in bright white letters on his sanctuary screens, just as his own worst day arrives. The guy who spent his entire life defining grace for others, well, he's about to find out what happens when he's the one who desperately needs it. And it all comes down to the number 12. 12 is everything in this opening moment. It represents the agonizing 12 minutes before a massive 8,000-person Sunday service kicks off. The band is playing, the crowd is hyped, and Nate is just standing backstage in his suit. But 12 also represents the 12 pages of a devastating public statement that has just dropped on the internet. A statement that is actively destroying the life Nate built, minute by agonizing minute. Imagine standing in that narrow backstage hallway. Suddenly, Nate's phone starts vibrating frantically. We're talking 23 unread messages from his staff, from his family, all pleading with him not to go on stage. Then his executive pastor, Mark, literally sprints down the hall to deliver the news. Claire, a former staff member, has just posted something massive online. And you can feel the tension here. Nate isn't just a guy finding out his secret is out. He's a highly visible public figure realizing his darkest secret is currently being read by thousands of people sitting just on the other side of that wall. That brings us to part one of our explainer, Claire's devastating statement. The story doesn't give us a slow build-up. It plunges us immediately into the wreckage right alongside Nate. Claire, a 27-year-old former communications director at the church, publicly details an 11-month relationship with him. And right out of the gate, in the very first paragraph, she introduces a word that flips the entire script. That word is abuse. She's incredibly honest, acknowledging her own confusing feelings, even admitting she cared about him and sometimes initiated contact, but she absolutely refuses to let those feelings mask the reality of what actually went down. This right here illustrates the core conflict of the whole situation. The contrast is just incredibly stark. Nate is desperately clinging to the language of a mutual affair between consenting adults. He keeps throwing out phrases like, "she was an adult," and "we both made choices." He wants to box this in as a standard moral failing. But Claire's reality? It exposes a crushing, inescapable power dynamic. She points out he was 51 while she was just 27. And more importantly, he wasn't just some guy. He was her pastor, her boss, and her spiritual mentor. It's a whole different ballgame. Which leads us perfectly into part two. The power dynamic trap. This exact friction is what forces everyone to take a hard look at what actually happens when spiritual authority gets tangled up with personal desire. It begs the question, can a choice ever truly be equal when one person holds that much power over your career, your life, and even your faith? Now, Nate vehemently rejects the word abuse because, in his mind, abuse strictly means physical coercion. Because Claire wasn't physically forced, he's totally blind to the reality of spiritual abuse. And just to be clear, that's when someone leverages their spiritual authority to manipulate someone's boundaries. Nate completely fails to see how his massive authority over Claire essentially compromised her ability to choose freely. When the guy signing your paychecks is also the guy guiding your soul, yeah, the line between consent and compliance gets dangerously blurry. To really drive this home, Claire reveals something Nate said to her in a hotel room. Maybe God allowed our connection for a reason. Let the weight of that sink in. That is a terrifyingly dangerous thing to say when you're an employer who has literally spent years teaching this young woman how to hear God's voice. For Nate, it might have been some casual, romantic rationalization. But for Claire, she didn't hear that from just an ordinary married man. She heard it from the ultimate spiritual authority in her life, who was essentially framing their secret relationship as God's actual will. Even before the church elders strip Nate of his preaching duties, his closest colleague, Mark, confronts him with this devastating question. Nate keeps trying to defend himself by saying they both made choices, but Mark pushes back and asks, were they equal choices? This is the exact moment Nate's defensive vocabulary completely falls apart. The institution steps in, the security guards won't even make eye contact with him, and he is just unceremoniously sidelined while a worship leader awkwardly tells 8,000 people that Pastor Nate won't be joining them today. And while the church tries to quietly manage the PR nightmare by calling it an inappropriate sexual relationship, that phrase mutates online in a matter of minutes. Nate's ruined life turns into this fierce, polarizing cultural vocabulary test on social media. Strangers everywhere start debating his life, labeling it everything from grooming and spiritual manipulation to cancel culture and hypocrisy. His private failure instantly becomes public content. Moving to part 3, discovering the full story. In a single afternoon, Nate loses absolutely everything. His megachurch, his reputation, his book deals, the whole shebang. But here's the crazy part. This massive, inciting incident, it's literally just the beginning. The real story is what happens to Nate and his family in the quiet, painful aftermath. It brings up this agonizing psychological question. What if becoming a better person doesn't actually mean getting your old life back? Nate has to learn that even if he finds grace and even if he truly repents, he might never get his pulpit back. Grace doesn't just automatically entitle you to a microphone. So, does Nate ever truly understand the structural harm his authority caused? Can his family even survive this kind of fallout? To find out, you've got to read the rest of the story. You can do that right now by visiting imaginarytalks.com/pastor who couldn't be forgiven, modern disgrace story, to read the full story. Because this explainer leaves us with one seriously provocative thought. If grace covers your worst day, does it also mean the people you hurt are obligated to let you back in? Head over to the site to find out.